The clock above the counter ticked past 8:50 p.m., its hands dragging through the final minutes of Lena's shift. The cozy corner cafe smelled of burnt coffee and cinnamon, a familiar haze that clung to her apron as she scrubbed the last sticky spot on the counter. Lena Jackson, mid-30s, black, with tight curls spilling from a loose ponytail, hummed softly to a jazz tune playing through her earbuds. Outside, snow dusted the pavement of the sleepy downtown street, the kind of night that made you crave a warm bed and a quiet mind. Another day down, she murmured to herself, slipping off her apron. Her coat was thin, patched at the elbows, but it'd have to do. She locked the cafe door, flipped the sign to "closed," and stepped into the biting chill. The wind tugged at her scarf as she buried her hands in her pockets, her boots crunching against the fresh snow. Lena loved this walk home, despite the occasional sidelong glances from neighbors who still saw her as an outsider after 15 years in this town. Born and raised here, she'd built a life, worked her way through night school, landed this job, cared for her late grandmother until the end. Yet some folks still looked at her skin and decided she didn't belong. She'd learned to let it roll off her, mostly. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, like it carried something more than snowflakes. She'd barely crossed the first intersection when a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a gray suit, crisp and expensive, his leather briefcase gleaming under the streetlights. Richard Grayson, she'd later learn his name, was in his 50s, with a stern jaw and eyes that cut like glass. He strode toward her, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders about some deal gone sour. As they passed, his gaze flicked to her and lingered. Lena felt it before he even spoke, that familiar prickle of judgment. She kept walking, head down, but his voice sliced through the quiet. "Hey, you." She stopped, pulling out an earbud. "Me?" Richard's lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, you. What are you doing out here? This isn't your street." Lena blinked, caught off guard. "I live here. I'm just going home." He scoffed, loud and deliberate. "Live here? Sure. People like you don't belong in a place like this. Why don't you go back where you came from?" The words hit like a slap, sharp and cold. Lena's chest tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "I came from here, sir. Born 2 blocks away. Good night." She turned to leave, but Richard wasn't done. "Don't give me that. You think you can just strut around like you own this town? I've seen your kind, always taking what's not yours." Her hands balled into fists inside her pockets. She could feel the heat rising in her throat, the urge to snap back, to tell him exactly what she thought of his venom. But she'd been here before too many times. She took a slow breath, the jazz in her ear fading to a distant hum. "Not worth it," she whispered to herself and kept walking. Behind her, Richard's voice boomed into his phone. "Richard Grayson here. Yeah, I'm on my way." His footsteps faded into the night, leaving Lena alone with the echo of his words. She shook her head, trying to shake off the sting. "Same old song," she muttered. "Different singer." But as she cut through the alley, a shortcut she'd taken 100 times, something shifted. The air grew still, the wind dropping to a hush. Then she heard it, a low, pained groan. Lena froze, peering into the dimness. There, slumped against the brick wall beneath a flickering streetlight, was Richard. His briefcase lay overturned, papers fluttering in the snow. His hands clutched his chest, his face a mask of agony, pale, sweating, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Oh my God," Lena breathed, rushing forward. She dropped to her knees beside him, her mind racing. Hey, can you hear me? Are you okay?" Richard's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. "Help, can't breathe." She recognized him instantly, the suit, the sneer, the venom still fresh in her ears. For a split second, her hands hovered, a storm of thoughts crashing through her. "This guy? The one who just tore me down?" But then his head lolled back, a choked sound escaping his lips, and instinct kicked in. She yanked out her phone, fumbling with cold fingers to dial 911. "Yes, I need an ambulance, corner of 5th and Maple, in the alley." He's having a heart attack. Please, hurry. Tossing the phone aside, she loosened his tie, her hands trembling but sure. She'd taken a first aid course years ago for her grandmother. Now it was muscle memory. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, feeling a weak pulse. Stay with me, she said, her voice firm. Help's coming. Richard stared up at her, confusion flickering through his pain. You? Why? Why are you? Because I'm not you, she snapped, sharper than she meant. Then, softer, just hold on. The wait felt endless, seconds stretching into eternities as snow piled around them. Lena's knees ached against the frozen ground, her coat soaked through. She could hear his breathing falter, see the panic in his eyes. And beneath it all, a quiet rage simmered. Why am I here? Why am I saving him? Finally, sirens pierced the night. Headlights flooded the alley as an ambulance screeched to a halt. Paramedics swarmed in, barking orders, male, 50s, possible cardiac arrest. And Lena stepped back, her hands shaking. They strapped Richard to a stretcher, his eyes locked on her until the doors slammed shut. A paramedic clapped her shoulder. You did good, ma'am. Kept him alive till we got here. Lena nodded numbly, watching the red lights vanish into the snow. She stood there, alone in the alley, the streetlight buzzing overhead. Her breath clouded the air as she whispered, "What the hell just happened?" Later that night, Lena sat on her sagging couch, still in her damp coat. Her tiny apartment was a mess of thrift store furniture and memories. A photo of her grandmother's smile down from the wall, a reminder of gentler days. She stared at her hands, still feeling the ghost of Richard's pulse beneath her fingers. I could have walked away, she said aloud, her voice cracking. He wouldn't have done it for me. Would he? She stood, pacing, her mind a tangle of anger and exhaustion. She stopped at the photo, tracing her grandmother's face with her eyes. You'd say it's right, Nana. Don't let their hate become yours. But it's heavy. So damn heavy. She sank back onto the couch, pulling a blanket tight. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the flicker of that streetlight and the sound of a man's fading breath. 2 weeks later, the cafe hummed with its usual morning crowd. Lena poured coffee for Mr. Daniels, the old regular who always tipped in quarters, when the door chime rang. She glanced up and froze. Richard stood there, no suit this time, just a plain sweater and jeans. His face was softer, hesitant, and in his hands was a small bouquet of daisies. The coffee pot trembled in her grip, a splash hitting the counter. She wiped it up, her heart thudding. You're back on your feet, she said, guarded. Good to see. Richard shuffled forward, setting the flowers on the counter. Yeah, thanks to you. Can we talk? Just a minute. Lena hesitated, then nodded, leading him to a corner table. The chatter around them faded as she sat, arms crossed. What's this about? He swallowed, his hands fidgeting. I don't know how to say this right. That night, what I said to you, I was a bastard. Worse than that. And then you saved my life. I've been asking myself why ever since. Lena's eyes narrowed. I didn't do it for you. I did it because it's who I am. You don't get to decide who deserves help. Richard flinched, nodding slowly. I deserved nothing. I've spent years looking down on people like you. Thought it made me strong, important. But lying there, dying, I saw it. I'm nothing without that hate. And you're everything I'm not. His voice broke and Lena felt a pang she didn't expect. She leaned forward, her tone sharp but steady. Words like yours don't just vanish, Richard. They cut. They stay. You think flowers fix that? No, he said quickly. They don't. I'm not here to fix it. I'm here to own it. To thank you, not just for the ambulance, but for waking me up. I was blind. I don't want to be that man anymore. Lena studied him, searching his eyes. There was something raw there, something real. She softened, just a fraction. Keep the flowers. I don't need them. But if you mean that, prove it. Not to me, to everyone you've hurt. Richard nodded, standing. I will. I promise. He left the daisies on the table and walked out, the chime ringing in his wake. Lena stared at the flowers, then picked them up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. That night, Lena walked home under the same streetlights, the snow lighter now. She paused at the alley, gazing at the spot where it all unfolded. The jazz in her earbuds swelled, a saxophone weaving through the quiet. "Some nights change you," she whispered. "Some people, too. Even the ones you'd rather forget." She pulled her coat tighter, her shadow stretching long and steady into the dark. The world wasn't fixed, not yet. But in that flicker of light, in that single act of grace, it felt a little closer.